Know all of you out there have seen the headlines on YouTube coming out of China from Peking University and Tsinghua University that they have developed analog computing, analog chips, and that these chips are 1,000 to 3,000 times faster than NVIDIA GPUs, and they do this while being remarkably energy efficient. And so now many of you in my comments have asked me to cover this. I'm going to do that for you today, but first I need you to hit that like and subscribe button down below. Please subscribe to my channel. Okay, let's go ahead and let's get started. First thing is this real? Because some people come on and they ask me, is this real or is this hot air? And the short answer to this is yes, this is absolutely real, okay? And the physics of it is absolutely real. Everything that they're talking about in these papers, absolutely real. These chips are for real, okay? There's no question about that. But the real question is are they a threat to NVIDIA? And that answer is more complicated. And I would just have to say that right now, NVIDIA is probably not worried. Okay. I'm saying probably, but I'm going to explain why. Okay. So first of all, let's talk about NVIDIA's GPUs and the main problem that they have. The biggest problem with the GPUs right now, or any CPU out there, has to do with memory. Okay, your processor, because it's digital, what happens is the processor is like, hey, I'm going to do a calculation. So then it goes to memory and it gets the values. And then once it has the values, it has to transport it back to the processor. And then the processor takes those two values and it computes it. Let's just say it adds it up. And then it takes the result and it transports it back to memory. Okay. And so what people don't even realize is that the most energy in a CPU spent is actually in the transportation of this data to and from the processor to the memory. That is where you're burning all the energy, not in the actual calculation that happens within the processor itself. Okay, it's in this transport back and forth of the memory. And these things are doing trillions, of calculations per second, even more than that. And so they have to go back and forth to memory over and over again. And that is the bottleneck. That is the waste in energy. Now, you might say, wait a second, didn't you say Google's TPU solved this problem? I didn't say they solved it. I said that they improved upon it. So what they did is Google's TPUs used an idea called a systolic array. So they went ahead and they set these chips up in a specific way to represent the array. And so at the beginning, it still has to go to the memory and get the data, but then it runs it through and it passes it from one chip to the other. So instead of going ahead and passing it back to memory and the next chip going to memory and getting it, it passes it directly from one chip to another and they flow the data through it, right? And they call it systolic, because they flow it through there in a rhythmic way that they think represents a heartbeat. Okay. And so then what happens is at the very end, your answer comes out after it goes through the systolic array, but they still have to go back and forth to the memory every now and then. Okay. Much more efficient than NVIDIA's GPUs, much more specialized, but again, still not perfect. Well, analog chips have fixed this problem, and they fixed it by using something called Ohm's law. And if you remember Ohm's law is, I hope I don't get this wrong, it's been a while, current equals voltage divided by resistance. And so what they do is that they set up these chips and they physically actually represent the array that they're going to do the calculations upon. So they set up these capacitors and they put everything in a grid-like pattern, okay? And they set up everything in a grid-like pattern, and at all the intersections, they put capacitors. And then the weights for the model that they want to run are put into these capacitors. And then they flow the electricity through, okay? They flow the electricity through, they can adjust the voltage, and then when the answer comes out on the other side, guess what it is? It's your current. And it's like, wow, this is actually super amazing. And so when you hear about this, it uses something called resistive RAM, and they also use light. So each university is using something different. But the whole point is now the processor never has to go to memory, bring it back. It's just, it is the matrix. So, I said that earlier with Google Ironwood, right? Where I said it's representing the matrix, but this is one step forward. This is literally is the matrix, and it is using physics, i.e. Ohm's law, to calculate, which is just mind-boggling. It's so cool how it works, okay? And I love that portion of it. But there is a problem here, okay? And in case, maybe I should give you an analogy too, because you might not understand what that was. No, we'll skip the analogy. That's good enough, right? So we have a grid, we have capacitors at all the intersections of the grid. They look at the model that they have for the AI, they put the weights on the capacitors, and then they flow the electricity through, and then they measure the current when it comes out, okay? And they can adjust this flow, and based on it going through these weights, that is the calculations they need to perform. And then when it comes out at the end, they of course have it all in the exact way they want it to go. And then at the end is the answer, okay? And so here is something that confuses me, and I will explain why. But these chips, okay, even though, okay, let me reposition myself here. So these chips, I think by the name analog, they should be extremely precise. Now, you can argue with me down in the comments below, but the simple fact is that they are not, okay? And the reason for that is that the environment is noisy. So they're using physics, but the problem is when you're using physics, i.e. you're using electricity, things can affect that voltage, that current, et cetera, et cetera. The environment can affect it. They have this problem in quantum computing also, where quantum computing is the physics, right? And so error correction is a big part of quantum computing, but here they don't have the ability to do error correction because it's not as specific as quantum computing is, where they kind of know where the errors are coming from, okay? So in these systems, and I say this is a problem because in my head, I think that analog should be more precise because, you know, if I have a graph, an XY axis, and I draw a line on it and I put 2 points on that line, right? Between those 2 points is an infinity of other points, okay? And if I go within the infinity of points and I pick 2 more points, there's another infinity of points, and that's analog. Analog is the line. And so digital is discrete. And so digital is like the integers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But analog is like the real numbers, right? Where you have the infinite amount of numbers. It's a much bigger set than the integers. So I would think that analog would be, by the name of it, should be more precise. But then the simple thing is that's counterintuitive. That's why I had to take a stop back there, is that analog has to deal with the environment. And these GPUs do not because they're digital. So yes, they are in a 0 and 1, which is discrete, but that's not going to get infected by something. Okay, so once it's a 0, it's a 0. Once it's a 1, it's a 1. Over here, this current can be affected by stuff. And so this is a big problem. And they talk about this in one of the papers where these chips would not be good for training large AI models. Okay, because in the training of the large AI models, you need extreme precision. In fact, some of them will use 64-bit, precision. And when you get to a number that large, these chips, simply put, are not precise enough. But where they would excel is in inferencing, and i.e. running the AI, so on the consumer side. And so in my head, I can see these chips being a very big deal in edge computing. And remember that China's government set out a goal that it's going to rate the success of AI by 2030 and how far it has penetrated into consumers, into the average Chinese citizens' lives, and made their lives better, improved upon their lives. And so this chip could help with that because it will be able to, you could put it in a smartphone, you could put it in cameras, you could put it in all these devices, right, where you're running AIs, and the precision doesn't have to be as precise. And in case you're wondering about that, I can't get into all this because it gets pretty complicated, but basically when we're inferencing, they're always coming up with a new data type to represent the objects, and they've actually went from FP32 to FP16, FP8, now they're down to FP4. And you might say, that sounds counterintuitive. Why are they getting smaller and smaller? And again, the answer is because they don't have to be precise, and the concern that they have is they want energy efficiency and speed, okay? and that's just the way it is. And that's where these chips would shine. But that's not NVIDIA's market. NVIDIA is involved on the training of these chips. Yes, of course, you're running some inferencing on these chips, but the majority of dollars that they're spending, these AI hyperscalers, this is in the training of these models. Okay. So when you hear about Meta or OpenAI and they're building these data centers, it's because they expect to be building these new AI models and continuing these LLMs that are using billions and trillions and quadrillions maybe one day. I'm just kidding. I don't think they're going to get to quadrillions, but just tons of parameters. Okay. So that's why I don't think NVIDIA is too worried. Okay. Now you might say they could improve that, but as from what I understand, that would be very, very difficult. Okay. And then the other thing that's a problem with these chips is they are not flexible. So right now, when they have to change these, change the model or change the weights, you have to have literally a team of these smartest PhDs in China, okay, that have to calculate the weights for this new matrix and how it goes into this grid. Okay. And so that is not an efficient way. Whereas NVIDIA's GPUs can just run any AI out there right now. And if your, AI doesn't run on NVIDIA, you could, port it to it rather simply, not maybe simply, but much more simple than how these chips would work. Okay. So these chips are very inflexible. So I guess you could say they're more like a plastic mold in a sense that when you set them up, they're harder to change. Okay. And of course, the researchers have stated that they're looking for a way to automate this process, and they might. But there's another problem with this flexibility is that these chips and the way that they work, if you listen to what I'm saying, they only do matrix multiplication and that's it. And so if AI was to pivot, this would be a big problem. Not that you couldn't use them for other things. Of course, matrix multiplication would be great in many other areas besides AI if it was to pivot, but it would become useless for that purpose. And you might say, will that ever happen? Well, we don't know. Right now, there are a lot of people out there, some of the smartest minds in this, from the East, from the West, that say that LLMs and how they are being built right now, and that I believe in this, that LLMs are not going to achieve AGI and ASI. Okay, they simply aren't. You can't just keep throwing more parameters at them. They are fundamentally flawed. Now, everybody has their different ideas of how to achieve AGI and ASI. Just in case you're wondering, my personal idea is that will require a quantum computer because I believe that Roger Penrose was correct when he said consciousness is quantum mechanical in nature. Okay, that there's these quantum processes going on in our brain. But the simple fact is let's just imagine a world where it pivots. Let's imagine it is quantum, right? It is quantum. Then these chips and GPUs are going to be sort of useless for this task. But the thing about GPUs is that they are more general purpose than these chips, these analog chips. Once they're set up, all they can do is matrix multiplication. That's it. Okay. They don't do anything else. And NVIDIA's chips are highly specialized, but they're not that specialized. Okay. They still could do other things. Okay. So that's another knock against these chips. But maybe you're like, hey, I think LLMs will make AGI, so even if that's the case, there's another problem. And that problem is simply put that the environment is not developed for these chips. On this channel, I've talked about how CUDA is NVIDIA's moat, okay, against the rest of the world. And that Jensen Huang, the reason that he wants the US so badly to sell chips to China is that he says, and rightly so, that if we can get Chinese developers hooked on CUDA, we control the tools that they use. And he's absolutely right. And this is why China's like, hey, yeah, that's absolutely right. You guys over there, stop using these chips. We don't want to become dependent on them. It's also why companies like Meta, Google, etc., are not using CUDA. They don't want to be locked into a proprietary software developed by NVIDIA. However, it's still a benefit because it's this great entire ecosystem that's already built. And the simple fact is even if you don't use CUDA, there's other ecosystems out there for you. Yes, they vary in size and depth, but when we're using digital, we've been using digital so long that, and it's so similar that you can go ahead and you can look at tools from other ecosystems. And even if you have different architecture, it's similar enough that you can port them over there. I.e., when you heard about DeepSeek switching over to Huawei's chips, the CM386 from 384, sorry, I can't remember, from NVIDIA's, they were switching from the Ascend accelerators from NVIDIA's H800s, okay? And so they did have to get help from Huawei, but they were able to overcome this, okay? They were able to port what they needed. And so with analog, you simply can't do that. It's an entirely new paradigm. And I'm not talking like ARM versus x86. This is completely different. It's not digital, it's analog. So everything, every single software tool at that fundamental level would have to be rewritten. And so then the question is, how do you get common languages? I'm just going to throw one out there like C to run on this. It would be very difficult. And would you want to even use that? Because now would the algorithms that you use be very different also, right? Right. So you have this, and that would take time too. And so the ultimate thing here I'm trying to say is that I don't think that NVIDIA is too worried about this, right? Because ultimately, if it's in the lab right now, it's going to take minimum 3 to 5 years before it comes out. And that's, assuming what are they going to have, how good will it be, And then you have to say, what about the ecosystem? And then it's like, well, it's not really able to train. It's just on this end. So there's all these things kind of working against it from there. Now, when I say this, I'm not saying that it's not a big deal. It absolutely is, because edge computing is super important. Remember, China has stated that they're going to flip the pyramid. They're going to invert the pyramid. The pyramid is in America, where if it's a monetary value, it's at the bottom, and at the bottom is Jensen Huang, and Sam Altman hopes he's down there, i.e., the people at the base layer that make the hardware and the models, they're getting all the monetary value. China wants to flip that over, and they want to put all the value in the consumer's hands. And to do that, edge computing is going to be extremely important. That's why they're making so many open source models. Okay, so now you have this open source model. I need to be able to run it on my phone. Well, I can't put an NVIDIA H800 or a Blackwell system in my phone, right? But I could put one of these analog chips, and they run more energy efficient, and they run 1,000 to 3,000 times faster. Okay, so that's where it would be a huge deal. But again, NVIDIA is not in the chips for phone space. They don't do that. Okay, and then what else is there? Oh, one thing I don't know if I cover this. One thing that is good about these chips is they would help China. Here's another benefit to them, is that China right now is suffering from the U.S. sanctions, right? They are under, the U.S. has put these sanctions on China, and they've been under them for quite some time. And China, of course, has responded greatly. They've shown their resilience, they've shown their innovation. But the simple fact is that not having the latest EUV machines from ASML does hurt them. Well, with these chips, you could develop them on the existing hardware that China already has. It does not require advanced EUV lithography machines. And so that would also be a huge boon to China. Okay, so there you see how I'm saying this. I hope you understand what I'm saying. I've covered this topic. So I don't plan on covering it too much in the future, because really it's a lot in the future. It's at minimum 3 to 5 years. Something like this, if it got pushed back 5 to 7, I would not blink an eye. Okay. And even after it comes out, you have to develop the ecosystem. Okay. I mean, there's a lot to it, right? And you want to know my honest estimation would be that these chips will not be making any type of impact until probably around 2033 to 2035. It's going to be minimum 8 to 10 years. They might have them out in some very small cases here and there, but until they have a major impact, if it pans out, it's going to be at least 8 to 10 years. Now, I might be wrong, and you can let me know down below in the comments. That's what we do here. We have great discussions. So that's what I got for you guys on the analog chips. Absolutely real. But again, I don't think NVIDIA is too worried. And as you know, China is, of course, they're not going all in on this. They are going forward with digital too. So they're taking a multi-pronged strategy to this. And yeah, I think that's very smart. Okay, that's what I got for you guys. Hope you enjoy. Have a great day.